recorded as well. So my name is Levy. I am the head of healthcare for UK public sector for Amazon Web Services. And today we wanted to talk to you a little bit around some of the trends that we're seeing, not just within the UK, but also internationally, around how systems are using data to unlock insight and deliver better integrated care. So we always like to start by emphasizing, so AWS, we are the cloud computing arm of Amazon. So we are not part of the marketplace, but we are part of the company that provides the compute, not just to Amazon, but actually a breadth of customers around the world. And from a healthcare perspective, and I think that this is really, really important. So I'm part of our international public sector health leadership team. And across the world, we are all bound by a similar vision. And that is really focused, and I know we heard a lot of conversations even in the innovation session just now around how we're supporting systems to digitize their healthcare data. And the reason that we focus so much on the digitization of healthcare data, it's because we understand that once that data is digitized, that's when you're able to start using it to make different decisions that impact how clinicians deliver care, how systems plan care, and most importantly, how citizens consume that care. And across all the work that we're doing, we really do focus on 4 key value drivers within there. So number one, when we're talking about healthcare data, particularly patient-level data, we know safety, security, and compliance is job zero for us. And the number one way that we can earn our customers' trust is making sure that we're hosting that data in the most secure environments possible. When I started my job, so I'm an epidemiologist by background, I actually took over the business 2 years ago. And I think it's fair to say 2 years ago, a lot of the conversations about cloud were technical conversations, they were infrastructure conversations. But actually what we've seen, and this has been accelerated a lot as a result of COVID, is around how cloud capability is actually driving the innovation agenda and how we're supporting companies to actually adapt those roadmaps, use new capabilities and services, particularly focused in that analytics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence space, to actually move much more quickly than they'd be able to do in the past using much more traditional approaches to technology and infrastructure. And as I said, tied to our vision, a real focus of that, and I cannot even tell you the conversations that we're having, whether we're having them centrally, whether we're having them locally, whether we're having them with hospitals or primary care networks, every conversation right now that we're having is really focused on the data, how we're bringing that data together, how we're organizing it, particularly focused on how we're extracting insight, not just from structured data, but unstructured data, and actually turning that into consumable information that allows people to make better decisions. And the reason that we're so focused on that, and I think this is where you start to see our Amazon ethos come through, is really around supporting that personalized healthcare agenda. I feel quite strongly, a lot of the times when you hear about personalized medicine, precision medicine, you tend to think of those higher value services, so around personalized therapeutics, diagnostics, care delivery. But when we're talking about personalization, it's everything from that time that citizen first starts interacting with the health and social care services, how we're making sure that we're organizing those services, we're supporting them to move through those services, and really taking into consideration their preferences and how they want to interact, consume with their healthcare teams. So I'm going to focus a little bit about trends that we're hearing within the UK, and then I'm going to bring in some case studies from internationally. Can you hear me okay? They said to speak loud. I'm trying to speak really loud. So what are we hearing from some of our ICS customers? So I think really, really importantly, and once again, we've heard it today, and indeed I think it's reflected in the work that InterSystems is doing in Northwest London. ICSs are going to be required to integrate their data in order to make different decisions. And when you talk about being a system integrator, that also means that ICSs are going to have to become technology integrators, because many systems, most systems, have a range of point solutions across their ecosystem of care, and bringing those together in a way that's organized around the people who actually use it, those end users, is going to be an increasingly challenge. From a data perspective, I think a lot of conversations originally were focused on, particularly on the clinical data, how you're using EHR data. We were just hearing some of that. But actually now what we're starting to see is how do you start to bring in some of the multimodal data sets, the digital imaging data, the genomics, to really create much more comprehensive data sets that are built around individuals' clinical data, their genomic data, their socioeconomic data, and a range of other data sets that actually, when you run them through the algorithms, can yield very, very different results depending on the breadth of data that you're consuming in the first instance. One of the things that's been really, really exciting for us to see is actually how COVID has changed the nature of partnership across the NHS. I think we've seen incredible stories around how NHS organizations are partnering, partners between industry and the NHS, and partners, in fact, between industry and industry, where we've all come together because we were all faced with a similar challenge, really putting away some of those competitive threats and constraints that somehow can limit how we actually interact with each other to really focus on very, very quick problem solving. And then also, really, really importantly, and I think that we don't talk about this enough when we're talking about digital transformation, is the importance of skills and how you're actually going to empower people with the right skills, not necessarily to get hands on keyboards. It's not always about hands on keyboards. There's lots of people out there from industry, from the health tech who know how to do that, but really understanding how do you actually start framing business problems? How do you start procuring technology solutions? How do you actually think about it from a finance perspective? What does that actually mean on an ongoing basis? So it really opens up a range of conversations beyond hands-on keyboards that we're really, really keen to support. Because what we know, and we've seen this across many of the places that we work, is that sometimes, and I probably shouldn't say this as AWS, the technology can be the easy bit. It's actually the business decisions, the process changes, and the people changes that actually will drive whether or not innovation is successful and scales or not. So what does that actually mean from our vision, and what are we doing across the ecosystem where we work? So one of my colleagues was just on stage, so we do a lot of work across the NHS with health tech organizations and also clinical genomics and research. And really the vision that we're trying to promote and what we're working across the NHS and UK healthcare on is how we can actually start using all of the information that is generated as a byproduct of clinical delivery, a byproduct of how citizens interact with the systems, to actually start driving an infinity loop based on how we're starting to connect that data, using that to actually stratify populations, really understand that risk from a clinical but also a financial perspective, how we're using that to start thinking about new models of care. So one of my colleagues was talking about next generation hospitals. What does a virtualized care delivery model look like in a new world? How we're actually coordinating care across pathways. And once again, I will call out the work that InterSystems is doing in Northwest London. When you actually look at the breadth of information that they're going to be integrating into their systems to really look across not just community care and primary care, but also bringing in the social care and all the different points of care that our patients interact for. And that's typically, and most of you will know this, is where those patients and citizens fall through the cracks. Enabling citizens to actually be a part of that ecosystem of care and actually be an equal partner in the decisions they're making. And also really, really importantly, how you're using that to monitor outcomes, drive improvements, and actually accelerate the research agenda. And I think one phrase that I've heard across customers, across policy documents, is around ICSs as a learning system. And one of the things that we believe really, really strongly, it's only once you actually can start using all those data assets and getting those insights that you can actually create that data-driven learning systems that the ICSs aspire to be. So specifically then, I wanted to drill into pop health, because population health management, because when I think about population health management, it's really the how. It's how you actually start looking at and thinking about new models of care and how you're delivering that in a more integrated way. And whether or not, now I'm going to expand this beyond just the UK, these are challenges that we're hearing absolutely everywhere that we're working right now. And it's amazing how many systems actually are looking at the NHS in terms of what they're doing and trying to emulate some of the early successes that the NHS has had in terms of bringing care together. But challenges, first of all, around data liquidity and integration. So standards comes up time and time again. Even where you have standards, how are you actually using those standards and enforcing those standards? Interoperability, that's come up a lot today about how you're actually bringing together that data across the system. But one conversation that I think is really, really interesting is actually around real-time data, because I think that there is now, everybody thinks everything needs to be real-time, and that can be really challenging. So really understanding what are the use cases you're trying to solve for, what needs to be real-time, what needs to be real-time-ish, and how you're actually staging that data strategy and integration journey in a way that mirrors the actual needs and the use cases that you're looking to deliver. Second area where we see a lot of challenges is around person-centric and clinically relevant. And this is, once again, it ties to this whole idea of data being a byproduct of clinical delivery to support that ecosystem. How do you use the same data asset, whether that's at a system level, whether that's actually at a local level, and whether that's at an individual level? So you're really focusing on how you're actually creating that single pane of glass and moving away from a very, very traditional data environment where you define a use case, and then you're looking to assemble that data to answer that specific use case, rather than having a federated data environment that allows you to actually be much more flexible with the right security access to be able to accommodate a much, much broader range of use cases without always having to start from scratch. Clinically meaningful and accessible. So I spend a lot of time working, in my previous role, I spent a lot of time working with clinicians in primary care specifically. And the thing about AI is that it's really, really important that even the AI and the algorithms, those are there to enable better clinical decisions, but they need to be explainable, because ultimately that clinician needs the information to be able to understand what decision that they're making. So how we're explaining some of the models and the analytics in a way that is clinically relevant is increasingly important, particularly as you're bringing together more data, which could potentially mean that you're increasing some of the clinical risk by virtue of the access to information that clinicians have. And also making sure it's very much events driven, so it's the right information at the right time, the right place, based on the needs in front of you. And then the last bit, I've talked a lot about actionable insights, but the last part I will point out is, I think that what we've seen is that systems have gotten a lot better at looking at how you start to stratify data to inform commissioning decisions. I think the real opportunity, and where we're seeing a huge amount of innovation, is how you actually then translate that into an individual care setting. So you're actually using that same data once again to support next best action with that patient in front of you. How am I making sure that I am making the best clinical decision for that individual based on their unique needs? And often, and this is where we're seeing a lot of the challenges now, that means moving away from a very pathway-centric approach that was used in the past to one that's much more holistic and designed around that individual patient. So I am going to flip now to some of the technology design principles, and I was laughing with one of the presentations in there as well, which I will talk about them, but if you ask me very technical questions, I will have to defer that to my colleagues. But some of the common themes and design principles we're seeing across the systems where we're working. One, I think this ties to what I was talking about around the fact that right now, so much of what we're seeing is partners coming together to support a continuum of care, and that's really what we mean when we talk about being a technology systems integrator. That means you need really modular and easy to integrate point solutions into this broader platform. Platforms seem to be the buzz phrases that we're hearing time and time again. I've talked a little bit about that self-generating data layer, so how you're continually using that data as a result of the operations that you do on a day-to-day basis. I mean, not just operations, surgical operations, but NHS operations full stop. I mentioned flexible and interoperability with that common ontology and data catalog to make sure that that information has the same standards. So much time is spent actually making sure that data can come together and is shareable. How can we take away some of that burden by actually influencing and enforcing some of those common standards? That makes it a lot easier to share information across systems. I mentioned with regards to getting that balance right between batch and real time. Security and privacy, making sure that particularly when we're looking at patient data, that we're maintaining to those highest standards. And I think an interesting debate that's coming more and more is around the whole idea of patient consent, and how, as we're looking across systems and we're capturing data and holding it for a long time, how are we actually getting patient consent in a way that actually evolves with the use cases so that they can opt in and opt out in a much more flexible way than they can at the moment. I mentioned a more extensive ability to support use cases, and really, really importantly, I spent a lot of my life defining products, and I was shocked when we would do audits of how much investment we make in features that nobody uses, which was always slightly soul destroying. But I think when you speak to a lot of product people, it's amazing how many of their features don't get used, is making sure we're making it super, super easy for people to interact with this technology, particularly across an ICS. We know that the more clicks that people have to use when interacting technology, the less they're going to use it. So we really need to make sure that we're creating a usable single pane of glass. And it doesn't matter who that user is, but actually it always looks and feels like you're interacting with a single system. I'm going to just touch on this briefly. I think I'm going to probably run out of time, but one of the things that we also stress very, very much, and we have at Amazon, we have a process called working backwards, which is very much focusing on the business problem you're trying to solve before you start looking at technology. Technology is an enabler. It is not a solution into itself, but making sure we're defining those use cases, and whether that's the planner, whether that's the clinician, whether that's the patient, but being really, really clear about the problem that we're trying to solve, And then when we start looking at the architecture, thinking, is there ways that we can accommodate the range of use cases in a single enterprise architecture design? Just to give you then, to end, a few examples in terms of where we see this working. I actually had this from a previous presentation where we were talking about some work that Rush Medical Center, this is in Chicago, where they knew that there was a huge problem with health equity across their systems. And they actually built a data lake, bringing in not just the clinical data, but also the socio-demographic data in order to inform better planning decisions about where they were going to actually invest their resources. One of the things that's really interesting, and actually it's the only thing about the US health system, I can say this as an American, that I would call out, is that they have much better cost data. And when we're looking at planning decisions, particularly within the NHS, being able to understand costs in an integrated care system is going to be really important. But within this model, I think half of the hospitals across Chicago were actually sharing their data within this data lake. They had that socioeconomic data built into it as well. And when they started looking at the interventions that they could implement for the population, the thing that was extraordinary is that they weren't clinical interventions. They were often tied to housing, they were often tied to education, they were tied to public health, and that's actually where they were going to influence the outcome for a broader group of patients than they would by waiting for people to actually get sick, turn up in the hospital, and do something at that point. I think, and I'm going to say it again, I think I've mentioned it a few times, I think another great example where we're seeing it here is actually the work that InterSystems is trying to do with Northwest London. I mean, it's a huge population. I think is it 2.1 million that are going to be affected by this data set that's designed specifically to look at similar use cases. How do you use that breadth of data to make better commissioning decisions, design more tailored interventions to actually redesign how care is delivered across pathways of care? I mentioned earlier that actually making sure that clinical insights and making the data clinically relevant is really, really important, and we know that this is a huge challenge. This is an example, once again, it is an American example, working with a company called Omeda Health, and they actually delivered they were one of the first companies to deliver a digital diabetes prevention program across the state. So this was a Center for Disease Control funded program, really focused on identifying high risk of type 2 diabetes patients and intervening early. It was very, very people-based, venue-based, which was great, but expensive, really difficult to scale. Omeda came in, they built a digital platform to support it on AWS, and through that they were actually able to, for the people who engaged in the program for about 12 months, they were able to reduce that pre-diabetes, risk of diabetes in the type 2 population by 30%. And the thing that I really like about this example is that not only were the clinicians consuming that data, being given recommendations about what to do on the specific patients based on their unique profile, but also Omeda built in two-way communication channels so then that clinician could interact, outreach to that patient, get information back, and actually create that two-way dialogue to inform their prevention program moving forward. And then last one, and once again, I think, and I'm as guilty about it ourselves, I think sometimes we forget to talk about the patients and the citizens enough when we're actually looking at digital transformation. And here was an example, and this was actually at the height of COVID. It was in New York City, highly deprived area, and they could tell that they had about 80,000 patients who were at risk of high risk of COVID because of pre-existing conditions. They had a very traditional outreach model, telephonic based, where they were limited fundamentally based on how many people they could outreach to, based on the number of callers they had. Within 3 weeks, they built a chatbot. With that chatbot, they were able to scale it in 3 weeks. And within 6 weeks, they were able to reach out to 80,000 members to be able to actually assess their risk profile and actually put together a much more tailored plan in place. Now, I think from an engagement perspective, I think it was something like 15% of the people who they reached out to engaged in the program, which sometimes there's always work you can do on an engagement perspective. But if you just think about the fact that they actually got to that full 80,000 in the first instance, which would have taken them months and months and months and months to do using the traditional model, that's where you really start to see some of that disruptive thinking. So I will end with, hopefully this was a whistle-stop tour while you were eating, although I appreciate some of you stopped eating, so thank you. The message that we always like to leave people who we're working with, and like I say, we work directly with the NHS, also with suppliers, health tech supporting the NHS, is that one of the things, and I use it in previous life talking about working at the top of your license, whether, and that's a clinical setting, but also when we're talking about it from an innovation perspective. And where we see our role is fundamentally around how can we take away some of that undifferentiated heavy lifting, some of those infrastructure conversation, technology design conversations that really allow you to focus on where you can add most value and let us do some of that heavy lifting on your behalf. So thank you very much.